Hello everybody, my name is Sean Linetto, and for my theory review paper, I did it on James Marcia's ego identity statuses. So just a background on James Marcia. He is a clinical and developmental psychologist who has spent much of his life researching and writing about psychological development. He is currently an emeritus professor of psychology at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, Canada, and he also has held professorships at SUNY Buffalo. He's most known for his extensive work in psychological development, specifically focusing on adolescent physiological development and identity development. So the theoretical foundations of his identity ego statuses is really grounded in Erikson's identity development. Erikson's identity development described that there were 8 stages of development. Stage 1 through 4 dealt with early childhood and a person's transition to adulthood. Stage 5 represented a basis of identity development, and stages 6 through 8 represented a basic culmination of adulthood. And it is within stage 5 that Marcia's ego identity status is derived from, called the identity versus identity diffusion stage. So Marcia's original work was called Development and Validation of Ego Identity Statuses in 1966, published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. He wrote this while he was at SUNY Buffalo. It focused on how ego identity statuses affected one's overall psychosocial identity development. Essentially, he wanted to see how individuals within stage 5 of Erikson's theory, how they really resolved identity crisis. He also based this work off of 4 previous studies, as mentioned below, but they really went into the characteristics of ego identity achievement, but did not deal with psychosocial criteria or direct behavioral consequences, which were more direct goals of Marcia's intended research. The 2 prominent themes, though, that he found in those previous studies were a variability, stability dimension of self-concept, and overall adjustment. So Marcia has 4 types of identity egos. He constructed these 4 types of egos prior to his actual initial experiment, because he wanted to categorize his experiment subjects into these egos. He established 2 variables to basically base these egos off of, which was crisis/exploration and commitment. And the 4 egos are identity achievement, identity diffusion, moratorium, and foreclosure. This is just a slide basically to further explain the 4 identity development stages. So if you want to just take a closer look at it to get a better meaning of what each stage means, here it is. So his goals of the research here, I've basically laid out the 6 hypotheses that he intended to discover within his initial work. A lot of it had to do with the identity statuses and their relationship to self-esteem, aspirations, and how they all went together. So the methodology that Marcia used in his initial study, it was an 86-person population. All 86 members were white males from Hiram College. It was administered by 10 experimenters. All of them were his classmates. He trained them. He double-checked them to make sure that they were up to date on the experimental procedures and what he wanted out of them. He also limited some information from the experimenters so that they could not implicit any biases during the actual implementation of the study. So he used 4 main methods to conduct this study. One was a concept attainment task, which basically incorporated stress elements, which were evaluation, apprehension, and over-solicitation. He did 15 to 30-minute interviews where he was able to basically ask questions relating to other variables such as occupational and religious political ideologies. And it's really in these interviews that he was able to categorize these subjects into one of the 4 created statuses that he made. He also implemented an ego identity incomplete sentences blank to help out to see how that correlated with the actual identities. And he also did 2 self-esteem questionnaires, which were 20-item tests. So just to look at the order of his methodology, he had these subjects basically complete the ISB and the self-esteem questionnaires first. Then they were brought in to interview, which basically took 2 months for him to complete. The day of the experiment, they were administered the CAT test under stress test experimenters that I just mentioned. Following the CAT test, they were called into his office where he basically did an invalidated self-definition, either positive or negative, of their actual work. After the meeting, they retook that self-assessment questionnaire a second time, and then once they completed that second self-assessment questionnaire, that was the end of the study, and they were given notice the next day that the invalidated self-definitions were not true that they received the day prior. So the most interesting findings of this study was that his main hypothesis was upheld, that identity achievement subjects received better scores on CAT exams than subjects with lower ego identity. This also was further supplemented that the achievement subjects had less instances of giving up on these CAT tests. There was a very drawn out grading rubric for these CAT tests, but the less that you gave up or the less that you asked questions, the better you did on them. As for attainment, all four of the subjects' statuses actually set goals higher than their attainment. However, foreclosure subjects exhibited this the most. They were the most unrealistic about their goals and future aspirations. However, the time spans between those self-assessment esteem questionnaires, because one was given at the beginning and one was given at the end, it was 2 months in duration. It resulted in unreliable and insufficient results, which actually negated a lot of his initial hypotheses that he wanted to focus on. A very interesting thing that I found out of this study was that Marcia had placed foreclosure subjects in the lowest status of his 4 positions. However, that was the result of this study, but before it, he actually placed the identity diffusion subjects at the lowest during the pre-experimental stages. Some common critiques, there's a bunch of them actually out there. Some believe that Marcia created a self-structure that processes individual development on the individual themselves, implying passive environments where they don't have essentially any control over identity development. Some believe that Marcia improperly and inappropriately used terminology in Erikson's theory within his identity statuses. Yoder believes that Marcia's status lacked comprehensive and realistic description of the identity formation experience, and believes that there might be some barriers that were put in place due to this development of the statuses. And I think the biggest critique is that his original work focused solely on white males, which excluded women and racially minoritized groups from his study, which now questions its applicability to the 21st century. So directions of future use is right back on that last critique. He needs to look at maybe involving different nationalities and minority populations to better situate these statuses and this theory in the 21st century. If you were to redo this experiment, I think he would also want to limit the time in between the self-assessment questionnaires to basically reduce the unreliable and unintended biases that came about them. And also, people should really examine external variables and their relation and impact on the adolescent identity development and statuses. So 2 studies that are based off of and rooted in Marcia's ego identity status is Bintry and Tapio 2004 and Berzonsky and Niemeyer 1994. Bintry and Tapio looked at basically subjects' identity statuses and alcoholic consumption. They found that people in the foreclosure status consumed more alcohol than in moratorium status, and they also found that foreclosure subjects benefit from more authoritative viewpoint educational programs, whereas this would be less effective for the others. Berzonsky and Niemeyer really looked at differences about self-relevant information and how they negotiated identity issues, and they basically found that moratoriums and achievers go through informational approaches, foreclosure goes through normative styles, and diffusive identities are more towards the avoidant approaches. They also suggested that self-constructs can enable subjects to orient towards environments in automatic manners, stating that less cognitive effort may be required over time. A follow-up study done by Marcia and a colleague Schneidel looked at ego identity, intimacy, and sexual orientation and gender. They used Marcia's initial framework. This finding suggested a significant relationship between identity and intimacy, where females really successfully looked at issues of intimacy prior to identity issues, where male were the different subjects. Male subjects were also high in identity and high in masculinity, and the same went with females. It's interesting to look at this considering the changes in current society, given the development of sexual identities and gender since this experiment was conducted in 1985. And I would believe a more recent study should be replicated of this to basically incorporate the acceptance and inclusion of multiple sexual identities in today's culture. Here's just a couple references that I was used during this project creation, and I hope that you enjoyed my presentation. I look forward to your feedback.